Labor and the Great Recession, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage from the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. The world economic crisis has prompted belt-tightening in economies across the globe. Protests by workers upset with cuts mandated by austerity plans have rocked Europe in recent weeks. In what is arguably the strongest trade union movement in the capitalist world, European labor is feeling besieged. Since the end of World War II, capital and labor in most European nations have maintained an implicit social pact that allowed for largely peaceful coexistence. Structural economic changes at the national, regional, and global level, however, have altered the power dynamic, challenging the union's ability to fulfill their role as the defenders of their members' economic and social interests. Here to tell us more about Europe's changing labor environment and the implications for the U.S. union movement, we're joined by Keith Bender, Associate Professor of Economics at UW-Milwaukee, who specializes in labor economics. He also serves as a research associate at the Center for Research on International Economics at UWM, and an associate member of the Center for European Labor Market Research at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Keith Bender, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I wonder if we could start with just kind of a bit of a background. I think one of the sort of turning points for most analysts in European labor was World War II and sort of everything that happened then up to another benchmark we'll talk about in just a minute, the Thatcher era. So what was sort of the landscape after World War II in Europe?
Right. Well, I think one of the landscapes is just the diversity. I mean, it's in a way, it's hard to summarize exactly what goes on in Europe because you have different laws in each country that govern both the labor market in general, trade unions in particular. You're exactly right that World War II or the post-World War II era was a watershed time, although I think you do have to put in a little bit of context pre-World War II to say that the union movement was actually quite strong even before then. And the idea of some partnerships between capital and labor were even evident pre-World War II. But certainly after World War II, there was a much stronger relationship, partially because of the rebuilding effort that happened in many European countries after the devastation of World War II. And that partnership sort of engendered a more cooperative working relationship across most countries. Germany and the Nordic countries in particular have that strong partnership type of idea.
So, and are we talking largely about public sector or private sector employees as well?
Right, actually both sectors. The rates of union membership are quite high. The amount of partnership that goes on is quite high. And as you mentioned in your introduction, the implicit relationships and the implicit social contracts were very strong across both sectors. Often those were explicit contracts, not just implicit contracts.
How so?
In comparison to the U.S., and it's maybe the best way to offer those comparisons, because we know a lot about the U.S. and the way that the union movement and the contracts that are set up in the U.S. tend to be much more micro-oriented. So they're either, if there's no union, it's a contract between the worker and the firm. But in a union context, it's usually between a particular union in a particular place and the firm. In Europe, though, in general, what they have is that the union contract covers not only what goes on in the firm, but maybe sector-wide or industry-wide. So you're talking about much larger rates of coverage. So where in the United States we have union coverage of about something around 14 or 15%. It's not unusual for many European countries to have union coverage. So this is where unions control wages and conditions of employment for upwards of 90 to 98, 99% of all workers in countries such as Austria, France, and a lot of the Nordic countries. So that explicit relationship there covers so many individuals that it's not surprising when there's a problem in the employment relationship that it has national implications rather than just maybe regional or local implications as it would maybe in the U.S.
So, for example, when there are strikes, we hear of the rail workers or the sort of nationwide rather than this particular company.
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the great paradoxes in this sort of international research is France. I know we want to talk a bit about that. If you look at union membership is actually lower as a proportion of employees in France than it is in the U.S. Right now, union membership is around 12% in the U.S. It's around 8 to 9% in France. So you would think, well, you know, there's no union movement in France, but yet they cover something on the order of 95% of wages in France. And so when unions call a strike in France, everybody is affected, and so a lot of people, even if they don't belong to the union, respect the union strikes and the barricades and such like that. So yeah, it doesn't look like there's a strong union movement, but because of these overreaching effects that there's this strong social contract, the implications go throughout the economy.
Well, and as we mentioned a little earlier, sort of another benchmark in the evolution of the European labor movement was sort of the Thatcher era, when some of the things that are in the news today about austerity and the reduction of benefits for union workers were very much part of that agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that? Sure.
Well, I think it was a movement not only in Great Britain under the Thatcher administration, it was echoed in the U.S. under the Reagan administration. It was picked up maybe less prominently in mainland Europe, but you saw that. And I think part of it was an austerity type of measure that governments, particularly in the U.S. and the U.K., didn't like the amount of, high compensation and such for a lot of these public sector workers, and many of them being in unions. I think it was also a response to sort of the globalization that was really, for the first time, really affecting both what was going on in the private sector and ultimately what was going on in the public sector as well. And so that was the motivation, I think, for the Thatcher and the Reagan attitudes towards unions in particular. As I said, it really didn't have an initial effect on mainland Europe, although I think that now, we continue to see the effects as these European governments are having to deal with budget issues and such, and one way to deal with that is to cut labor costs.
And, to what extent was it strictly an accounting exercise where, we've got too much going out and not enough coming in, and more of a fundamental ideological shift? I mean, do you think there was that component to it?
I think there is. I mean, that's sort of straining into maybe some political science stuff. But no, I think there was. Certainly the standard economic line about trade unions generally holds that unions tend to be rather inefficient in labor market contexts. There's quite a bit of debate about that, but that's sort of standard Econ 101 theory. And that idea gained more prominence in the 1970s and 1980s, and I think that did affect the political ideology of the time, and certainly we saw that in the Thatcher and the Reagan administrations. I think it's a little more difficult, and one of the reasons why maybe it didn't get into mainland Europe as much as it did in the U.S. and the U.K. Is because the labor unions in mainland Europe, although in the UK as well, often form political parties. Here, even though there's the correlation between the Democratic Party and the labor movement, there are very strict barriers about how much interaction there can be by unions in the political sphere. Those restrictions do not apply in many European countries. And so because unions were much more a political force, we didn't see maybe that transition into mainland Europe.
Well, and so we've got sort of the implicit contract or explicit contract in the immediate post-war period. Then we've got sort of a rethinking of some of this, certainly, as you say, in the UK and to a lesser extent on the mainland in the 80s. And what's been the trajectory since then?
Right. Well, since then, I mean, not much in the 90s because we had sort of a boom. Early 2000s, well, there was a little bit of pressure, but really the main pressures that we've had is over the last 3 or 4 years with the financial crisis that has impacted both the U.S. And European countries. Well, it's affected the entire world, but in particular those two regions. And I think the issue from the European side, particularly the mainland European side, is that you had a kind of perfect storm of a lot of things happening that has impacted the way companies behave, the way governments behave. Because of the financial crisis, there was less money for many of these governments in mainland Europe that tend to borrow lots of money to finance their government expenditures. They found that money was no longer there. And so that put pressures on the government to fulfill the types of infrastructure and things that those governments do. But it also impacted the private sector as well. So with all the international competition that was going on, firms were having a hard time competing too. So you had sort of that side that was affecting the revenues or the ability for governments to finance, plus you had all the pressures from the recession that would cause unemployment to spike, again, both in the U.S. and in Europe. So there was more money going out there. There are the demographic pressures of aging workforces that are particularly endemic in Europe, where they're aging even more quickly than the U.S. In general, the public pension systems in Europe are more generous than they are in the United States, so that added pressure as well. So there was pressure from both sides, both the revenue side and the expenditure side, that caused these crises in the governments of these countries, which resulted in these austerity measures that the governments needed to implement.
Well, and you know, there's a term of art during the Thatcher era in which they said it was a Tina situation. There is no alternative. I would assume the leaders of the labor movement would argue there probably is an alternative to some of these austerity measures. What?
Right. I mean, well, you could talk about maybe a lot of different alternatives, but I think the more general issue is that, again, this idea of partnership that we talked about earlier, and this idea that management and labor would work together along with government, and it's sort of a tripartite type of system. I think that at the end of the day, what the labor movement in these countries is really rebelling against, in some sense, is that there seems to be a breakup of that partnership. And so where there was discussion before and trying to think about ways of tackling problems that came into the employment relationship, you don't have that anymore. So you have, you know, more conservative governments coming in and sort of mandating what will be done, not doing it in partnership with labor or with firms. And I think that maybe is at the root of the problem. Not so much the austerity measures, although I think that plays a role. But I think it's in that idea of partnership, because that is so ingrained since World War II in the very fabric of the employment relationship systems in many of these European countries. And I think that's the major problem.
So the implementation of the austerity measures is really more about the implicit breaking of that social contract.
I think so. I mean, if you just take France as an example, France has had problems in the past, in the last 15, 20 years, with high unemployment rates and youth unemployment. And one of the ways that they've tried to deal with this, and this is, again, a partnership between the labor unions and government and employers, was to cut back on the work week, right? Because if you can cut back on the work week, you know, firms need more workers. They'll hire younger workers, or they'll keep workers maybe in a little bit later in the workforce, whatever. But that was a joint decision that was made across those three parties. And with the newer austerity measures, in France in particular, it's an idea about the retirement age and bumping that up for public sector pensions. I think the labor movement in France has felt that they were not part of that discussion, and maybe they could have figured out some other way of handling the problem, which is how to finance these public sector pensions, but I think they've been left out of that process.
Well, when we come back from a break, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the EU context of all of this, but right now we'll take a short break and be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about labor and the economic crisis in Europe with Keith Bender. Well, let's talk a bit about how the EU as a body figures into all of this. You know, when the Eurozone was first created, there were certain criteria that states needed to fulfill in terms of having their economic house in order to be part of the club. And what we saw initially in Greece was perhaps that was unraveling. Perhaps they actually weren't eligible to join the club. So is that what's driving some of these national austerity plans, to sort of bring them back into compliance?
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's sort of several different levels to the EU, which makes it a much more complex system to think about than say in the U.S. So one, you have the EU broadly defined, and that's sort of a free trade zone and that kind of thing. But not all the countries in the EU are necessarily in the euro. So some of the Nordic countries have stayed out. I think Denmark has stayed out. So you have that one level of difference. And then you have the core countries within the European currency union that have to adhere to the economic policies of that currency union. And I think one of the difficulties that these countries are finding out is that where you have a country like the U.S. that can have fiscal policy and monetary policy, they can work them together. In these European currency countries, they don't have that ability to coordinate the fiscal policy side and the monetary policy side.
Maybe it'd be a good idea just explain what the difference is.
Sure. Fiscal policy is government sort of spending policy or tax policy that they use to impact the economy, either to sort of give it a boost when things aren't going so well, or maybe to rein it back a little bit if you're worried about inflation. So it's government spending and taxes. Monetary policy has to deal with what do you do with the money supply. So the Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S. is what deals with this. So it sort of sets interest rates and the ease of getting capital for investment and buying and purchasing and that kind of thing. So economists sort of look at those as complementary things that if the economy needs a boost, as we've seen over the last couple of years, we've had both fiscal policy by cutting taxes and government stimulus, and an easing by the Fed to lower interest rates to try to stimulate the economy. In Europe, particularly in those Eurozone countries, you have a divorce of those two things, because the government still retain the ability to set tax rates to stimulate the economy by spending more or spending less, but the monetary policy side is all done really by the European Central Bank, which covers all of these countries. And so those two things can't be coordinated very well, and so that adds an extra level of pressure on these countries to coordinate what's going on between those two sets of policies. And where that's come down hard in a country like Greece is that you do need to maintain a certain level of fiscal responsibility in the government budgets in order to sort of keep the monetary side, the money side, good and working efficiently. And in the case of Greece, from my understanding, is one, they paid relatively generous pensions, so that pushed the Greek budget sort of to the edge. There was issues of early retirement, fairly generous unemployment benefits and other social welfare programs. And it looks like they cooked the books a little bit to make it look like they were in a much better situation than they were. And so with the overall financial crisis that we've seen in the last couple years, coupled with this pressure on government budgets, it caused a crisis not only within the Eurozone but for Greece in particular, and they had a very hard time selling bonds to finance the expenditures of government, and that's where the austerity measures had to come in, because the Greek government had to prove to people who were going to lend them money to buy the bonds that indeed they were trying to get their house in order.
Well, if there's a sort of implicit loss of sovereignty at some level in these supernatural organizations, and then as we've talked about a little earlier, the union movement is very involved in the political landscape of within the national context. Does that set up a certain tension?
That's exactly the tension, right? Because you have different levels of interactions that aren't necessarily compatible, and that has certainly generated a lot of the problems in Greece, but also other countries that are sort of on that edge. Portugal, Greece, Italy, or Ireland, and Spain. Those 4 countries or 5 countries are usually talked about in that same framework, and they all suffer from this tension of this sort of aggregate multinational currency union, and then what they're trying to do within their individual countries.
So, you know, an additional source of tension, I would think, is we saw, for example, Germany as the biggest player and the potential biggest donor to bailouts, butting up against a national election in which you know, Angela Merkel had to make that call as to what was perhaps at some level best for Europe, but politically not a very good thing to be doing if you're standing for election.
That's exactly right, and certainly in the German case, she was up against it, for trying to again satisfy both of those needs. Germany is sort of an interesting case because they are really the biggest economy in that monetary union, and indeed I think most of the economic research shows that they benefit the most out of the monetary union. Otherwise, because they have the strongest economy, their own currency, if they still had the Deutschmark, would increase quite dramatically in terms of appreciation, and which would make German products, you know, more expensive and harder to sell. So you have that issue in there as well, is that Germany really pushes for this monetary union because of the economic benefits from that, but they're also drawn in now because they don't want to have a huge crisis in the currency, because that affects everybody in the union, including Germany.
Well, let's jump across the ocean for a few minutes if we could. You know, we spoke a lot about sort of that social compact in which capital and labor in Europe really shared common goals, and there was a sense of working towards the benefit of all. I think you'd be hard-pressed to characterize the capital and labor dynamic within the U.S. in that way.
Well, yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, certainly historically, the nature of the relationship between capital and labor in the U.S., particularly by the labor movement, has been one more of conflict than cooperation historically. And I mean, there are lots of reasons potentially why we've seen a decline in the union movement in the United States. I think, though, interestingly, if you sort of follow what's going on recently in the labor movement, there has been a stronger push to maybe think about other ways of working with capital, working with firms to try to you know, keep that union movement or keep that relationship here. One of the things that we do in the program that I'm affiliated here at UWM, the Masters in Human Resources and Labor Relations program, is we try to lift up partnerships between labor and capital, and companies and firms and unions that try to build a more cooperative relationship. And for the last 12 or 13 years, we've tried to highlight some of those firms locally that do that. And I think that there is at least a small side of the labor movement that realizes that maybe this conflict thing just isn't going to work out, and that if you're going to have a strong labor movement, maybe you've got to think about alternative models like we see potentially in Europe.
And so what are the sort of features of that, at least traditionally, cooperative model in Europe that differ from some of the things we typically see here?
Sure. Well, the biggest thing is the amount of information that flows. What I talk about in my classes are the idea of what's called voice, but that's really all about information flows. In general, in a sort of standard collective bargaining agreement in the U.S., labor has its information, the firm side has its information, and they try to exploit that information to get the best deal that they can. Under sort of these more participatory and cooperative relationships, there's much more sharing of information between the two sides, so that, you know, everybody has the same amount of information, and you can get to maybe a mutually beneficial agreement between these two sides. Very often in the European context, it's helped by government either being a direct party in the relationship, in that negotiation. partially because you have these much broader agreements in Europe, as we mentioned earlier, or through government regulation to say that, there must be a certain amount of sharing of financial information and productivity enhancements or whatever that might be generated in that relationship. And so the characteristics of the firms that we see, firms and unions in the U.S. that we see doing this kind of participation, are characterized by that more of sharing of information and not having everything build up to when the contract ends in 3 years and then it all explodes, but having conversations within the contract as well to try to sort of either mitigate any problems or solve the problems before they actually get to sort of a crisis stage.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it at there. It's a fascinating look at union movements and both sides of the ocean and how perhaps there's a little cross-fertilization and impact each on the other. Keith Bender, thank you for joining us. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,